Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva. Today we're speaking with Dr. Sara Jordan. Sara is the former senior researcher, artificial intelligence, and ethics at the Future of Privacy Forum. Her profile includes privacy implications of data sharing, data and AI review boards, privacy analysis of AI and machine learning technologies, and analysis of the ethics challenges of AI and ML. And now over to the conversation with Sara Jordan. Sara, thanks so much for joining us here on the Private Podcast. We really appreciate you spending the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleased to be here, Derek.
Great. Before we started recording, we were talking about Putin, Ukraine, Russia, who would play Putin and Zelensky and Lavrov in the eventual dramatization of this invasion. So that'll give you some time frame reference for when we're recording this. But what we really want to focus on here is the type of work you're doing at the FPF and elsewhere. So can you tell us a little bit about your background first and what led you to get involved in things like data privacy, AI, and obviously all the technologies that back that?
Yeah. So I came at all of this as an academic. Oddly enough, like a lot of people in AI and ethics, I originally trained in political science, and I trained over on the political theory side of the house. But
Interesting.
I quickly, very quickly, the dissertation ink wasn't dry quickly, found myself teaching ethics and teaching particularly research ethics. And I that meant that I spent a lot of time dealing with data and dealing with data ethics. And as the scale of data grew, and the scale of research data that people were using, obviously the scale of ethical concerns grew. I also found that as my own interaction with data ethics sort of deepened, my desire to use some of those tools in machine learning to answer some of the questions I had as a researcher started to seep in. And so I would say my biggest introduction to sort of doing AI and building it myself and building it with a team was trying to build a classification engine for ethical text in regulatory statements. So whether or not that was statements and guidance that were issued on regulations.gov, the responses that people were giving back to regulators, and also trying to determine whether or not particular regulatory instruments were more or less likely to be commented on by professionals or by laypersons based upon the ethical import of the text that was in there. And so, like a lot of people, I started in NLP, and it just kind of grew from there because, hey, NLP is one of those great tools that allows researchers to do really nifty stuff,
Yeah. So for
including
anybody who
trying to
doesn't
figure out where
like,
the ethics lie.
yeah. So for anybody who doesn't like or doesn't know the acronym Natural Language Processing, correct? NLP.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And so, like a lot of people, I started with the ordinary sort of bag of words, corpora level text processing. And it was interesting that my exploration of a lot of the ethical language in regulations brought me to privacy concerns in a very oblique way. So, in looking at how people interact with notice and comment opportunities online, whether or not at the US federal level or the state level, I was noticing this weird and wicked pattern that people would put a lot of personal information, including health information, in comments on text or regulation opportunities from Health and Human Services, from USDA, from state health departments, etc. And some of it was a little bit frightening um, from the perspective of how are these people who are crying out to governments for help going to get help through this instrument? And thinking about it from the perspective of the user's ultimate sort of privacy and security, how can we build these online notice and comment systems to where that information is automatically redacted or automatically restricted from other people to see? I didn't need to see. Nobody else needed to see anybody else's comment about their healthcare opportunities or their medical record numbers, for God's sakes, that were up on regulations.gov.
So like people are on like I'm thinking of like Obama era like I'm on whitehouse.gov. There's maybe something related to HIPAA or Obamacare. I know there's the proper name for that, but the Obamacare legislation is saying like this would be great for me because I've had 3 heart attacks or because I've got stage 4 melanoma or something like that. Like just literally putting it out there for everybody to see.
Yes, along with their name, often along with the hospitals that they were treated at,
Oh wow.
along with, and my insurance payer, insurance company here didn't cover me, and doctor so and so. Like it was just this absolute trove of personal information, and people, I don't think, realized what they were doing to themselves
Yeah, like
in
doxing
terms of personal
themselves.
information exposure. Right, right. But also, I was really curious why the regulatory platforms weren't figuring out how to automatically redact that or automatically exclude those comments from people like me being able to go in and scrape them through the regulations.gov API. It was a huge challenge, and I never solved that problem because I left academics before being able to finish that, because academics is a wasteland of administrative opportunities with no research opportunities anymore. And I wanted research opportunities and to think again rather than to simply push accreditation paperwork. And so I left academics to future privacy forum.
Fair enough. Um, Can you explain a little bit more data ethics? I mean, like, I think that's a really important topic, and it's probably something we should have covered more deeply in the past so that private podcast listeners would have a better understanding of it. But, like, to me, on the surface, that sounds like I have a bunch of data. I need to figure out how to analyze it, scrape through it, etc., in an ethical manner, which maybe then takes you to places like I mean, obviously, anonymizing data, would be a big part of that. But what's the differential privacy? Maybe even adding some weird scattered data to help obscure things like that. Like, what when you talk about data ethics, what does that really mean to you and maybe your colleagues that you commiserate with the most about this?
Funny. I think it's so many things to so many different people. I mean, one of the big challenges to me in data ethics, AI ethics, etc., is that we have an absolute confusion of vocabulary. Um, and it's what I say is data ethics is going to be different from what anybody else says is data ethics, is AI ethics, etc. Gosh, if we could actually like go back to that sort of, ancient Chinese proverb of rectify the names first and get our definitions down, we would save ourselves not only a lot of time, but also ultimately a lot of money.
Yeah.
Because people pay a lot for AI ethics, for data governance, for AI governance, all of this stuff. And it's not always clear what you're buying. It's not always clear what we're ultimately paying for. But with
You've
that
got
in
the
mind,
spotlight.
what I
Yeah,
would
you've got
say,
the spotlight. So let's get the Dr. Sarah Jordan
yeah,
definition for data
yeah.
ethics and how you think about it.
I started with data ethics from the research perspective, right? How do we make sure that the people we are taking data in from, whether or not through surveys, whatever instruments, that we get meaningful agreement? And I'm not going to use the word consent because people don't read consent agreements, and information and voluntariness are often absent in terms of people's actual agreement to give you data. They don't have enough information. They don't have enough understanding to really autonomously decide. But for me, data ethics is about getting as close to that frontier as we possibly can in terms of getting the data to begin with. That's where it all starts.
Yeah.
But then you have to figure out how to manage and curate that data and put all the appropriate personnel, technical, administrative safeguards in it so that way it's not corrupt over time. So that way you've got provenance from person to analysis and you can trace it back. And that has to be done whether or not it's research level data, company data, whatever. To me, data ethics is about being able to know where it came from, how you got it, that you got it in a good way, right? That you didn't
Yeah.
just sort of
Scrape it
survey
off the
people.
web. Take
Right.
people's Twitter,
And
face or public Facebook and Twitter profile pictures.
Right. Right. Or that if you find things like what I found originally with my sort of use of the API to scrape regulations.gov, that if I'm finding comments where people are exposing tremendous amounts of personal health information, that I do the right thing as the person who is ingesting that data and let the agency know.
Yeah.
Take that next step to say, you have a problem where people are putting this information up here. I don't expect you to do this with it, but I expect you to do something and to continue to follow up, right? It's about protecting those people that gave you the data to begin with.
So then how does this parlay then into like AI? Like I guess cleaning up that data, treating it properly before it ends up in some sort of machine learning system, right?
You got to start there, right? That whole garbage out in, garbage out principle is really magnified by AI. Making sure that your data provenance and your data management is good is the first step to making sure that your AI is powerful and making sure that it works well. But I would take the same things about data ethics and port them over to AI governance and responsible AI. I'm I'm a little reticent to use the term AI ethics anymore because it seems like we're over anthropomorphizing AI when we even say that it could make ethical decisions. Um, it's still a machine. It's still something that we tell how to think. It doesn't make ethical choices. People do, and
Right.
I I hesitate with that phrase. But if we talk about responsible AI or AI governance, it's still about provenance, right? How did you decide you were going to use this model? How did you get the data? How do you know what data you have? How do you verify and document each step of your experimentation process to know this is the model that we have? And then how do you document all the way through to deployment? And after deployment, how do you make sure that it's still working right? I I hate to say that ethics is about documentation, but documentation is an artifact that you of ethical thinking. You know, we learn ethics through books. Documentation is the artifact of Kant's ethical thinking or Aristotle's ethical thinking. It's the same thing here.
Yeah. I feel like you should have been at Microsoft when they released Tay out on Twitter because that was very much a very interesting experiment that lasted maybe a day or two because very much of this garbage in, garbage out, principle where like, of course, people were like, oh, let me have some fun with this. And, sending Nazi and racist stuff to Tay,
Right.
which inevitably it started repeating on Twitter very, very quickly. And I don't know what the thought process was there, and I don't know if you know anybody who was working on that at the time, but like that seemed to very much be missing some of these principles you're talking about of like making sure that how some of the things you can feed into the algorithm or the model can then get turned around very quickly and start spitting out of this Twitter account. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how that all went down on Microsoft's side, but like that was an experiment. I maybe they learned a lot, but it was an experiment that quickly got pulled because of I guess abuse of the model or what have you. And I'm not expecting
I
you
think
to necessarily comment on that, but if you have
well,
anything
I
to
would
say, that'd be
actually
great.
say we all learned a lot from the Tay experiment. I think that we learned that people will always try to corrupt a system that is new. We're
Yeah,
going to try to break it. And we also learned that in AI, humans are the weak link, right? All of the discussion of AI bias or all of the discussion of, how AI has gone bad. What caused it to go bad was not necessarily the machine, but was our history and our interaction with it. I think the
yeah,
horrible lesson from Tay and from any type of algorithmic bias is that humans are horribly biased, malicious critters. And especially when we have the opportunity to interact with something that we believe is not going to be able to directly cause us harm or malice. Um, Something like an online
Sure.
chatbot, we will spew abuse at that thing because we don't have a mechanism through which to fear it. We don't have any way in which it will come back and correct us, right? A friend of mine always likes to say about it, still is a professor, he's like, look, if there is no pain, there is no learning. In the context of these online chatbots, there's no pain to the user for trying to introduce the worst possible language into that system. I'm not going to say we need to come up with some, creative way to allow computers to slap users that are feeding, horrible racist anti-Semitic comments to online platforms. But we do have to have some form of stick through which to introduce some pain so that they learn that this is unacceptable behavior. Because if not, we just continue to amplify that. AI is unfortunately a magnifier for the horrors of humanity. And
Yeah.
that is a great example of how that worked.
Now you're making me think that Simone Giertz should actually make that robot. If anybody could do it, she could. I mean, she chopped a Tesla in half and turned it into a truck, and has built all sorts of poor robots in the past. So I think this might actually be a really good robot of like type the N word at Tay, and the robot arm slaps you across the face. I know she knows how to make that happen. So because she's made a robot that does that to wake you up in the morning.
Right.
So now I'm thinking I need to go talk to her and be like, "Yo, I got this great idea for a robot."
It's not a horrible idea, right? Let's see where the experiment goes. Maybe we'll
Yeah,
discover that humans do react well to it. Maybe we'll actually get a positive lesson out of that experiment in the future,
yeah,
right? And to me, that's one of the challenges in like AI ethics is like we get really focused on this system that was built 2 years ago is doing horrible things with data that was gathered 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we focus really hard on that system for a little while and go, how horrible is this? And what I don't think we do well is actually follow up 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line to say, hey, what happened to that system? Did you improve it? And if so, have you corrected for the things that you thought were bad in it? Like, I really want a bit more wraparound in terms of the reporting about biased in AI or unfairness in AI, because people hear that, developers hear that, and they're eager to fix it. Right? This is a bug. We want to fix this. Clearly, my code's buggy. Right? Tell me how to do it. And if they do it, like, where's the good story that came out of it? Where's the
yeah.
positive?
Where's Tay V2? Where's Cammy or Angie or whatever you want to name the next one? Like where, like let's see it. Sure, to goodness, somebody took that back and went like, okay, let's fix this. And we don't know what they've done with it since then. It would be nice to have some sort of follow-up experiment on Twitter, Facebook, or Pinterest. I don't care to see what came out of that learning experience, as you said.
So let me pose something that I think one of the biggest challenges in AI and AI ethics right now is I feel like we've picked a lot of that low hanging fruit, right? We've said bias is an issue, fairness is an issue.
Right.
We've now figured out how to measure bias better. There's now companies that provide that, measuring fairness better. But we keep looking at the surface of AI and the AI that we interact with on a regular basis and the sort of in your face AI.
Right.
We need to start asking the questions about bias, fairness, sustainability, justice, enter litany of ethical principles here for the AI that we don't see, right? I want to start hearing people talk about what are the bias and fairness measurements that we need to introduce to assess the algorithms that help to make sure that data centers are cooled, right? Think about the clear importance that data centers play for all of us in all of our lives, right? This podcast wouldn't happen without somebody's data center and probably lots of data centers in many places to get this done. But it's algorithms that help to make sure that those centers stay cool, right? And that they have enough water and electricity. But those algorithms then have an effect on the community that lives around that, right? That provides the electricity, that provides the water, that, has to essentially take the heat exhaust out of those data centers. Okay, what about the fairness there,
Yeah.
right? What about the sustainability questions there? Have we taken sort of the geolocation of data centers and assessed it through our fairness metrics, however you want to mathematically define fairness, and determined whether or not it is fair for them to be located in this place in Oregon and this place in Virginia? And then how do we then expand that to go, okay, so here's all these data centers that are located in this place, these places, and why aren't they located somewhere else? Right?
Yeah.
Why don't people in, Caravel, Florida have the opportunity to work in those locations, to work in data centers, to work in data and AI, the same way people have in Corvallis, Oregon?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I guess like I don't know. To probably try and sum it up, hurricanes, cost I'm sure is a big part of it. But like I've never heard of that town in Florida, so maybe it's not that high cost. But yeah, that's certainly not. I haven't even done that sort of work in a really long time. I used to work with at Infotech Research Group, which is like a smaller Canadian Gartner or Forrester, and that was something that there was research that other another team was putting together about choosing a data center location and all the factors that went into it. So certainly there are people who will help you think about that, but why Google or Amazon, is obviously a really good example of US West, US East, US Central, and all these different places. I imagine infrastructure is a big part of it, but if you're always going to the places where there's already good infrastructure, then obviously you're putting locales that are already at a disadvantage at a further disadvantage. And I know that that's something that, especially for rural Canada and the United States, where we have vast tracts of land where there's
Yes.
nothing, or it's all farmland, or really poor internet connectivity for because of geographical issues and density and all that. You're literally just making it worse. And this urbanization, that has been happening for 70 to 100 years at this point, maybe more. Yeah, it just continues to get exacerbated more and more and more. Like there's multiple data centers in the Toronto area. That's great. But London, Ontario provides, for a lot of reasons, a really good, compelling data center location too. It's further away from lakes that could flood at any point in time. Um, um, Labor is still less expensive in my area here, and but water's available, power's available, like everything else you would want is available. But there's such a density already of people in Toronto and good fiber connections and all that it just can the that situation just continues to metastasize, I guess, on itself. um like Hamilton is probably the furthest away from Toronto that you get a really big data center, and even that's owned by a really big company now, again. So yeah, I guess for the most part that would be why, but there's all sorts of things that happen for those same reasons. Why does or until somebody like Volkswagen decides to build an auto manufacturing plant in Alabama, and everybody's like, "What? Why?" Until you hear them justify it, a lot of people don't think like, "Oh, right, there's lots of good reasons for doing that." And yeah, maybe you need to spend a little bit more capex to get that going, but the opex, operating expense for non-native English speakers, versus capital expenditure. So the operating expenditure or expenses could end up being much lower over the longer time frame, but it really it takes a long view to actually think about that, as opposed to, well, how much is it going to cost? Oh, it's going to cost us less to do it here than it is to there. Okay, done, let's just do that. No 5-year TCO, 10-year total cost of ownership type calculation appears to come into it. And I think, bringing this back to the original topic, I think this ends up coming back to the whole data issue of like, well, we could just go scrape it, like instead of putting out a survey and and actually collecting new data, we can just go buy it from somebody. We can go buy all this data from AOL or from AT&T about their users' browsing habits, or all this other stuff. And like that's something I'm very cognizant of what sort of services I sign up for that get that data, because I use a very small local ISP in comparison to Rogers and Bell, massive Canadian companies, or an AT&T, or Verizon in the States, um, because they do have very friendly policies and they don't collect data, and they would rather not. They have certain regulations to comply with for, like, whatever our privacy, anti music and movie piracy act is called up here. But besides that, they collect little to no data, and I like it that way. I don't even use the default DNS services, because A, it's less data for an ISP to grab. B, I get more control. Well, sometimes I get more control using a third party service that actually lets me log in and be like, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want this. Turn off gambling and other sites. Like, yeah, you're gonna see my data to help me do that, but I'm also buying myself a little bit of security, by giving that up. So I'm aware of the trade offs. Yeah, it just all comes back to what's the cheapest, easiest way to do this, and that is often the default for, especially for a large corporation that, maybe up until very recently is not thinking about, what's the term, diversity, equality, and inclusion type policies, or what was the being a good corporate entity type, those types of things. There's lots of shareholders who are just like, just maximize my value, please, and that's corporations often have a fiduciary duty to focus on that instead, unless it's very clearly outlined in their incorporation articles or whatever that they're going to do things a different way.
Don't you think, though, that part of the challenge of trying to get people out of that sort of shareholder maximized value, getting out of the how do I make this an easy monetary win, is actually being a little bit more creative with data? So it's easy to go and buy data from the same vendors. But just like you said, there are other vendors out there, and there are other ways to gather that data. You can go with an ISP that is small and local to you and provides you what you need. And I think in some cases, particularly in the AI space, we keep going back to the same data sets, right? People talk about image, things being overfit to ImageNet, or things being overfit to particular benchmark data sets. I would really love to see, and maybe I'll just figure out who I could do this with, is how do we determine whether or not some of the big AI that we serve on the consumer side is massively overfit to particular data vendors' data? So, advertising type of data. There's only a couple of vendors in that space. Have we essentially overfit all types of customer segmentation algorithms to those data sources? And if so, how do we unscrew that screw and start it again? And start to
Yeah.
think about this more creatively, right? How do we get people to think about AI with an Edmonton state of mind, or a Carabel state of mind, or an Alpine, Texas state of mind, rather than thinking about it from the perspective of a Toronto ring road or a Beijing ring road, right? We're so used to running in the same laps in our cities and running the same laps and the same data for our AI. And we've now trapped ourselves in so many ways. I think it's time to get a little bit spicy and to get a little bit more creative, with the data that we gather and the way in which we test the suitability of some of our AI, and to test the suitability of even how we think about it. If we keep thinking about maximizing profit, or keep saying the word optimize the function until we're just sick of it, we're just we're painting ourselves into a corner in really unhealthy and counterproductive ways.
Yeah. You made me think of zoom and enhance, but that's a different thing. When you said optimize function,
Funny.
zoom and enhance. Yeah, I mean, maybe to wrap this up, this particular topic up, I guess this would actually be something for somebody like Nielsen to really tackle, where they are a big name, they already have an existing business, and I would think it would behoove them to actually spend some time and effort tackling this, because it would actually benefit them in the long run to be able to offer better targeting or better ad sales or better data to people in Arkansas or in Alabama or New Mexico, as opposed to, where a large portion of the country lives on the coasts, in the U.S., and same with Canada. Like, almost half the country is or maybe more than half the country is in Ontario and Quebec. Lots of urban densification, mixed with a fairly large portion of rural areas as well. But all those people live within a certain sphere of influence, within London's sphere of influence, Kitchener Waterloo's, Toronto's, Calgary's, Edmonton's, etc. It's really easy to be like, oh, well, this is what people in Calgary like. Yeah, but Red Deer is just north of it, and
Right.
people in Red Deer might want something else, but you don't know because you're not bothering to segment that out, or you're not bothering to learn more about people in Red Deer, as opposed to just focusing on the Calgary census metropolitan area, or what have you, which is how things are often divvied up here, by StatsCan data.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, no, it's a very interesting thought, and it's not it's something I hear in passing every once in a while, and it's something I very occasionally think about, but it's not something personally I put a ton of effort into, mostly because I don't have a personal reason to, but at the same time, could benefit me in the long run, or would impact me at least, being somebody who lives just outside of a fairly large city and very much in that sphere of influence. But me and everybody else who lives near me don't live in the city for a variety of reasons. So there's definitely differences, as minute as they might be, to people who live in London, happy to live in London, versus people who live in Ilderton or Arva, just on the outskirts, and are not part of the same municipality. So.
I think that's a good point, though. Like, there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of the globe that is just not considered at all when we talk about AI, and even when we talk about AI ethics or data ethics, right? We have not really thought about collective, whole scale responsibility for data and for AI, where we actually think about and think hard, and not just in a glossy brochure that includes, you know there's a horrible phrase for it, but poverty porn images, of what we consider to be global diversity on whatever glossy we're producing. But actually think, how is AI, how is the data streams that we have going to help the people in Tonga? How is it going to help people who are living at the edge of a spade in some place with rock hard clay soil trying to scratch out a living? Um, we get really enamored with making sure that our AI performs well for us, but we have absolutely forgotten that all of our AI is overfit to 1% of the earth. It is not fit for the rest of the planet. Until we start asking those questions and start to think with, a Cook Islands state of mind about AI, we're just going to keep painting ourselves in the same corner and congratulating ourselves for having painted the corner smaller today.
Cornered the orange juice market.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
it's an old reference.
Yes.
I'm actually thinking of Johannesburg, South Africa, where, because I remember watching a couple of videos a few years ago of this person doing a poverty porn tour of, like, all these, yeah, but he was actually offering tours of the poorer parts of Johannesburg, so that straight white people could understand, like, yes, there are parts of Johannesburg that are beautiful and very high end and upscale, or whatever terms you want to use, but, like, feet from where you are, 50 feet, 10 meters, what, pick a distance and your preferred measurement style. you can encounter the exact opposite. People very much on the edge, or already over the edge and are living in a tent city. I was just in Denver, Colorado, a couple weeks ago, for ETH Denver, and downtown is gorgeous. It's very nice. State capital, beautiful. Less than a mile down the road, tent city. All these poor homeless people living like on the very edge of downtown, um, in tents. Like, and that Denver's not alone in that. I can go, a few kilometers from here and see the same thing. Toronto certainly has plenty of it as well. But this very stark contrast of like this big huge building with a beautiful mural on it, and up the road is the state capitol, and then but I just passed this tent city right on the edge of downtown. I'm like, wow, like this is, and talking to locals, they're like, yeah, and it's getting worse because of the same trends that have been happening everywhere, especially during the pandemic, heightened and accelerated during the pandemic of people choosing to move where they want to live. And that's great. Like, I don't want to limit that, but like, a dearth of housing supply, or an unwillingness to tackle root issues with homelessness and addictions and all that, as opposed to trying to treat the symptoms over and over and over again. Because not long after I saw Tent City, a day or two later, I'm like, oh, look, brand new building, and there's availability. Like, why is the local and state governments not getting together, considering city halls there, state capitals right over there, and like putting these people in a warm place to live, like until they get back on their feet, which is, something that pretty much everybody agrees now is a much better way to do that. And and we have the data to show that that's a much better way to handle that problem, is to actually give them a place to live, and it's cheaper, it's more effective, um, and yet governments all over the world persist with like, oh well, let's give them let's give them a little bit of money. Oh, how do we get them a little bit of money? Oh, well, they don't have a fixed address, so they don't have a bank account, and we end up back in the same vicious circle again of like, you can't get them support because they don't have a fixed address, and maybe they don't have a phone, so you can't even do that. And well, like, let's tackle it this way. Oh, well, we can't, there's always some sort of hurdle. I'm like, just put these people in a house or in an apartment so that they can actually like get off the street, and deliver food to them or whatever. Because letting them, like, hospitals are expensive, addiction professionals are expensive, although they're obviously going to be needed at some point for some folks. Like, unless somebody's literally choosing to live on the street, and those, that number of people is, I think, fairly small amongst that population. um, Putting them somewhere warm, safe, etc., so that they can actually get back on their feet is the most effective solution. And we actually have the data to show that. So, like, and yet we're not doing it. And instead, we live in this world of stark contrasts again and again and again. So, anyway,
Making sure that the rich don't get richer with data.
yeah.
Yeah. I think is the biggest challenge, right? How do we make sure that we don't keep asking the same questions? We sound crazy in terms of public policy solutions to complex challenges like homelessness or addiction or climate change. We keep trying to do the same things, and partly because we keep going back to the same wells of data, and we keep trying to fit the same type of models, right? And we keep trying to say, if we do it with just this one more additional data set, or just we'll use an XG boost rather than add a boost this time. Ooh, right? Then maybe we'll solve it. No, right? There has to be some sort of genuinely radical attempt to do something utterly different, including different data, including completely different models. And I think, importantly for what you're saying there, literally doing that with a completely different cast of characters, right? We keep going to City Hall. We keep going to the hospitals. We keep going to the known addiction nonprofits. But you know what? There's a whole bunch of churches out there with data that, if we could figure out how to help them harness that, will be a whole unused trove, right? Or literally talking to the homeless themselves. That whole techno solutionism thing, right? We have absolutely fallen in love married and are going on a second honeymoon with techno solutionism in the space of this pandemic, right? We started out technical solutionist from the very beginning, which was great. We had no other option, right? Let's just say March 2020 sucked wholly. And if we did not have the approach of techno solutionism we took to make everything Zoomified, right? Everything online, everything like this, things would have been massively worse. But now that we've learned that some of that stuff is not quite as shiny as we thought, and maybe we need to rethink it, having a little me time away from techno solutionism wouldn't be a bad thing, particularly to solve those problems like addiction and mental health and homelessness and accelerating issues of climate disasters. And to take that break from techno solutionism and looking at the same data and the same people and the same models and running them through the same like known vendors, low code solutions, and starting over with whiteboards and sticky notes in grubby classrooms, in under resourced, frankly, beige in all regards public schools in rural places. Start there. Why won't we start there? Why have we decided that is the unattractive solution, but banging our head against the same wall every day in this increasingly small corner we painted is an attractive solution?
I think it's because working through qualitative data like that is much harder than working through nice,
Yeah.
clean, quantitative data. But ultimately, when you actually go talk to somebody on the street to find out why they're there, how they got there, what they think would help improve their lives, etc., it's much harder to document all that and then turn it into something actionable. It's doable. We've done it hundreds of times before as a species, but it's harder and it's messy, as you pointed out. And I think the number of people who are willing to spend the time and money doing that, or to fund people to go do that, is unfortunately smaller and smaller these days, if completely non-existent. But I think that's a much better place to start. So flipping flipping things a little bit
Well, yeah.
because we're coming up to time here. What would you consider some of the
Sorry.
most important initiatives in the world of machine learning and AI right now?
Yeah, I think we still need to talk about how some of the major AI that we are faced with every day is replicating human misery. Um, Whether or not that is the misery of people who feel as if they have nothing better to do than to try to maliciously train an AI, right? Why is that still something that people want to do? How do we reimagine our strategy there? Um, Trying to diagnose the degree to which our AI is overfit to particular benchmark data, I think is a really important question. And also peeling back the layers on the unseen AI in our lives, right? Knowing more about the AI that helps to serve the electricity we have, or to serve the sewage treatment plants that we, at least in the urbanized areas, all enjoy, right? And to figure out, how were those built? Are they well maintained? Do we have governance and provenance on some of those so that we can do two things? One, make sure that if it breaks in the future, we can rebuild it, right? And two, we can export that to places that don't have it yet, right? We still have basic just sewerage treatment challenges in a lot of the coastal areas of the US and Canada. And some of that is just, there's literally still people cranking pumps when other places enjoy, you know, automated pumping.
Yeah.
Why haven't we addressed that yet? And making sure that people who build the AI have documented it so that it can be rebuilt. We have to go back and do some of the just grubby, it's not very shiny, it's hard to sell work of documenting our systems. of making sure that they're well governed from end to end. And it unfortunately it's going to be some re-engineering and it's going to be some reimagination, but bless it, it's time to get it done.
Oh, I mean, if not now, then when, right?
Right.
If I'm thinking of one of the founders of Real Networks way back in the day, made Real Player and all that other fun stuff, and Rhapsody. Um, Actually, it was Rhapsody, not Real. He came after. But a guy named Rob Reed, who's since become a sci-fi author, he actually wrote a book called After On, which it's half comedy but half really serious sci-fi, and he did a lot of research to justify like where he took the book of a an AI working for or being applied to a social network gaining sentience and the hilarity and catastrophe that comes after that. So basically, Tay comes to life, and then what? And or gain sentience, not comes to life, gain sentience, and then what? And I guess like we don't want to end up in that sort of situation and then not know how to turn it off, or not knowing even how we got there in the first place so we can prevent it from happening in the future. Um, yeah. So, like, do you feel like that's the biggest challenge that you, people in your industry, et cetera, are going to have to deal with this year? Is like, we don't understand how we got here. We need to actually go back and document all that. Or do you think there are maybe some bigger challenges that are going to have to be tackled in 2022 and the immediate future?
So that's going to have to be, where some of my work goes, right? And so as a personal challenge, yeah, that's going to be partly what I do. But I think it's something that's shared with a lot of companies right now, um, where they are realizing, hey, we've been building things in small code snippets and in small AI in a lot of different parts of the company. And we don't know what's where, who owns it, how it operates, and what its risk is. And I think there's an increasing awareness that we need to address that. But my perception is that there's also an increasing awareness that we need to right size our approach to AI, by which I mean we may not need AI at all. Um, because there's more people through the democratization of data, through the democratization of low code services, and through the democratization of data science, people are learning, hey, the challenge is not creating a better fit model, but is simply cleaning the data because we can, as the brilliant things that humans happen to be, despite the fact that we're malicious critters sometimes, right? We see those patterns sometimes before our computers even do. And so to me, that if there's one like ambition for 2022, beyond better governance for AI, continuing intelligent democratization of data science ability, um, teaching people to do it, and importantly, teaching people to do it outside of the same places that we have done it, right? We don't need more data analytics centers at the big research one universities. They need to live in community colleges, right? That people who go to work as police officers, nurses, teachers, sewage treatment plant folks every day so that they can learn this is what's possible with data and data analytics and bring that back to their workplace on a daily basis and solve some of those crappy problems that we have not figured out yet. But we have to take those tools to them, meet them where they're at, do it in places that don't look shiny first. At Lone Star Community College, not Stanford University.
Yeah, Fanshawe College of Applied Arts and Technology, I think is the full name. Like I went there, it was a great college, great 3 year
Mm-hmm.
diploma that I got there, and it's part of
Yep.
nursing programs. There's a police foundations type
Yep.
program there. I know the police here don't really care if you go to police foundations. They actually want university grads around here, but like, there's lots of good education happening there, and people learning how to code too. And so like you can do uh, uh, machine learning type stuff in the computer programmer analyst, if it's still called that, course. It's a 3-year program. You can do things at that level. It doesn't have to be at Western University or at McGill or at
No,
Ryerson, where they've built a large AI
right.
research center. And like that's great. And actually Ryerson is definitely off the beaten path compared to University of Toronto or what have you, at least historically speaking. But yeah, but it also doesn't need to be in Toronto. It could be
Right.
in Laval, Quebec instead, or it could be in
Yep.
Halifax, or better, Wolfville, Nova Scotia, instead of any of those other places.
Hmm.
Um, those are nice, attractive towns too. Sarah, thanks so much for spending this time with me. I think we had a great discussion here, and hopefully everybody else enjoyed it as well. If people want to learn more about you, follow the work you're doing, where should they go?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me also on ResearchGate for some of the research products. And you can probably find me on Google Scholar. So,
Okay. All right. Everybody else, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, stay free.